In the 7th century BC, the Assyrian Empire reached its greatest extent, blanketing over an area from Egypt to Iran. Its most famous kings, Sennacherib, Esarhaddon, and Ashurbanipal, championed the will of their god, Ashur, and brought security and order across the land. In the midst of this success, however, problems brewed beneath the surface. Assyria's historically troubled relationship with the Kingdom of Babylon in the south rose to the fore as rebellions and a string of wars carried on. The Assyrian king Esarhaddon successfully subdued Babylon for a time and created cultural peace, but this was merely temporary. Upon his death, he bestowed Babylonia to his son, Shamash-shuma-ukin, while the bulk of the Assyrian Empire went to Ashurbanipal. Esarhaddon's confident peace now began to crack as the two brothers grew distant and eventually threw the empire into civil war. The dual kingship had many apparent benefits, but it allowed an opportunity for discord. Shamash-shuma-ukin carried out many construction works like his father, restoring the dilapidated walls of cities and refurbishing the temples of many important gods. He made no attempt to satisfy the Assyrian elites, as he was king of Babylon alone. One can imagine how the Assyrians saw this as an advantage. Pandering to both sides had only been accomplished successfully by one king. Separating Assyria and Babylonia into distinct parts within the whole allowed the kings to commit to the unique interests of their respective lands. In reality, it only drove a political wedge between the provinces. Shamash-shuma-ukin's policies reflected a desire to draw lines between Assyria and Babylonia. Forging a separate identity was his way of creating power for himself, a possibility his brother should have anticipated better. The name of the Assyrian god Ashur was cleared from the Babylonian inscriptions, and even the seal of the king only made vague references to Assyrian tropes. Construction reports, titulary, and the relationship between god and king were modified to fit traditional Babylonian expectations. It is not that Esarhaddon never tried the same, but applied this method with caution. His son's liberal dose of Babylonianisms was not just a political move, it was self-beneficial. Shamash-shuma-ukin actively sought to establish his independent image and assert himself as the powerful lord of Babylonia. The climactic moment for the formation of Shamash-shuma-ukin's Babylonian identity was the final return of the statue of Marduk. Stolen from Babylon many years before, this statue had been the heart of Babylonian religious life, an object of the highest regard, integral to the most important rituals in religious political life. Its return had been many years in the making, and if Shamash-shuma-ukin was able to execute the operation successfully, he could finally assert himself as the hero he longed to be. Luckily for his pious hopes, the statue did make it back to Babylon, and the king's contemporary inscriptions make sure we hear about it. The great god Marduk, shepherd of the Babylonian people, dwelled in his land once more. Though Shamash-shuma-ukin was a committed Babylonian at this point, his brother's involvement in Babylonia reflected minimal interest. Ashurbanipal claims to have carried out several projects in the south, and even maintained a steady correspondence with officials in the area, but was not particularly enthusiastic about Babylonian identity itself. His Assyrian inscriptions hardly mention the return of Marduk's statue. Even his inscriptions addressed to the Babylonians only mention it generically. Additionally, he failed to incorporate this critical event into his titulary inscriptions. It is hard to discern the king's reasons for abandoning his connection with Babylon at its most vital moment. At best, it was oversight, and at worst, a concerted attempt to separate Babylonians and Assyrians after the unifying policies of his father. The more withdrawn nature of Ashurbanipal's Babylonian policies, and the growing distance his brother was creating between himself and his Assyrian identity, culminated explosively in 652 BC in the form of a civil war. Ashurbanipal discovered that Shamash-shuma-ukin had been plotting a rebellion, and sent letters pleading the Babylonian people to abandon their king. However, most major cities in the area supported their king's cause, along with forces from the Arab tribes and Elam. The Babylonians had mustered up quite a force that would be no easy task to take down. During the first 18 months of conflict, the Assyrians contended with Elamites and Arab and Babylonian forces in the rural spaces of northern Babylonia, while in the south, Ashurbanipal used the city of Uruk to launch attacks against the pro-Babylonians. Tribal Sealanders and Pukudu controlled much of the territory in contention in and around the marshes of the very south, pressing heavily into Assyrian forces. Nabu-bel-Shumati, the leader of the Sealanders, was a particularly great source of consternation for the Assyrians, who slander his name constantly in their correspondence. In 650, Ashurbanipal dispatched the military commander, Bel-Ibni, to reckon with the persistent leader. The subsequent fighting put great stress on the cities in the south, making food scarce and safety absent. In both northern and southern theaters, the pro-Babylonian forces put up an aggressive fight, but began to succumb to Ashurbanipal's well-oiled military machine. The northern cities of Sippar, Borsippa, Kutha, and Nippur were all being besieged by 650, while the resistance in the south was nearly crushed by 649. Shamash-shuma-ukin's troops were forced to retreat to Babylon, and a nearly 2-year siege of the city began. The last known documents from his rule come from the summer of 648 in the cities of Borsippa and Babylon. Shamash-shuma-ukin met a harsh death in his failed pursuit to find freedom for his people. As for Shamash-shuma-ukin, my hostile brother, who had planned murder against Assyria, and uttered grievous blasphemies against the god Ashur, the god who created me, he determined for him a cruel death. He consigned him to a fire and destroyed his life. His brother rarely mentioned him afterward. The age of Babylonian supremacy was over in Assyrian politics. A new vassal was installed, and Babylon left a byword. The prominent cities of Nippur, Borsippa, Babylon, and especially the Sealand to the south, lack records for the next few decades. Babylon would slowly slip out of Assyrian hands and go on to become the next great power of the ancient Near East. A tragic fall from excellent relations with Babylonia to the worst they had ever been sounded the death knell for peace.